Good afternoon. I would call the meeting to order for the May 14th. Oh, I don't have the right meeting. We've got two meetings going at the same time here. Hold on. Call the meeting to order for the May 14th special joint meeting of the City Council and the Finance Committee, May 14th, 2019. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
The record will reflect that all members, my apologies, that Councilmember Muldoon is currently absent.
He's on his way.
He is on his way, and then all members of the Finance Committee are in attendance.
All right, and the first item of current business is my favorite topic, the review of the proposed fiscal year 2019-20 operating budget. And for everyone who wants to know, that on watching, the proposed budget is available online at newportbeachca.gov/budget. And we have a staff presentation, please, from the city manager's first proposed budget. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be presenting the first budget, and I'll have our finance director, Dan Matiszewicz, kick it off here.
Thank you. Madam Mayor and members of the City Council, distinguished Chair O'Neill and members of the Finance Committee and members of the public, thank you for the opportunity to present an overview of the City Manager's proposed budget. I'd like to also recognize Susan Jean Grande and my budget staff in the audience who provided the brain power and the muscle behind this year's budget. So we prepared the budget with four cornerstones in drafting the proposed budget with our understanding of the community's needs. That would be high quality municipal services, safe and secure neighborhoods, keeping the city looking great, and fiscal sustainability. Now, getting straight to the point, so the budget is balanced. The budget assumes a strong property tax growth, while most other revenues are starting to show signs of slowing anyways. Proposed expenditures remain relatively flat. We adhered to the council guidance regarding the use of the 2017-18 budget surplus. We continue an aggressive payment schedule on our unfunded pension liability. We continue to focus on enhancing the community's quality of life and safety. We continue funding of our infrastructure master plan and neighborhood enhancement projects. The general plan update has been funded in the proposed budget. We also included funding for airport growth control efforts. And this year we're introducing a robust internal and external audit program. This is something that will add emphasis to our stewardship, and it was identified as an important initiative by our city manager. So the collective components are budgeted conservatively, and they emphasize long-term fiscal sustainability. So for those of you that are just joining us for the budget development or just tuning in, we've actually started the budget development process in the fall with a hard look at our operating liabilities, and those would include workers' compensation, general liability, pension, retiree insurance. And then we also look at our long-term infrastructure needs, including harbors and beaches, and our facilities plan. We meet with the departments to review revenue projections with our subject matter experts and seek outside opinion from consultant experts that specialize in revenues and the economy. So before we even get into operations, we have a pretty good idea where we need to fortify our financial security. We then hold a council planning session at the end of January. This year it was, I think, February. Then we propose an allocation of our prior year surplus. We calculate our personnel needs, start discussions with the departments and the city manager to identify where changes in service delivery might be in order. We make a preview of our revenue and expenditure assumptions to to the Finance Committee, and any other budget concerns that are worthy of mention. And then we're here today to have a joint meeting with Council and Finance Committee. On May 28th, Public Works will preview the capital improvement projects. Finance Committee will then make recommendations to support or adjust the budget. And with any luck, we'll have a budget for you to adopt or consider on June 11th. So a few years ago, we introduced a transparency portal that allowed members of the public to drill into the city's finances. And last year was the first year where we included the proposed budget. And in this year, it includes both a comparison of the both 2018-19 budget as compared to the 2019-20 budget. This portal allows you to aggregate and disaggregate the budget at various budget levels and various levels of granularity. So we'd really encourage folks to start here as a place to look at the budget. It can be found on the open data page of our budget. So it's the city URL /open budget. And if you prefer the more traditional approach, there is the 400-page static PDF version of the budget that is also available online, but it's mostly intended as an operator's guide that need the org and object level of detail. So new this year, just because the online portal might be intimidating for folks, we did include a small video on navigating your way around the budget. That might be something worth checking out. So moving on to the proposed budget in summary, it's in total, we're proposing roughly a $400 million budget, which includes $303 million of operating budget and about $44.5 million of new CIP appropriations. The rest of the CIP are just capital improvement projects that cross fiscal years. But again, the capital improvement projects will be discussed at the May 28th meeting. So in terms of the operating budget, you can see that the general fund makes up the lion's share, or nearly 72% of all of the operating budget. The internal service funds represent another important part of our financial strategy. And enterprise funds really only represent about 10% of all operating expenditures.
Dan, if you wouldn't mind going back for just a moment.
Sure.
Just a quick reminder that for those watching from home, general fund is where we can spend money on anything that's legal to spend the money on. Internal services funds are funds that we have departments pay into that can either be spent that particular year, such as technology, or over a number of years that builds up. So for example, in a fire department situation, they're not getting hit all at once for a fire truck. It is paid in over time for a reserve fund. Enterprise funds are your water and sewer, so those funds are self-contained funds where the revenues coming in need to match the expenditures going out, so there can be no profit in there. But I just wanted to make sure that when we're looking at this from a discussion standpoint, most people talk about it in terms of the general fund, and so this is what makes up our operating fund. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on to the sources and uses, this is a little bit of a complicated page, but we like to show that there are there's more than just the current revenues and the current expenditures. We do carry forward some surpluses from year to year that get reprogrammed in the following year's budget. And at the end of 17-18, we ended on a good note with a $13 million surplus. I wanted to show that entire $13 million surplus because I think that's the number people remember. But the line below it just indicates that we did utilize some of that surplus opportunistically when we looked to purchase Southern California Edison's 28 credits, and that was purchased a few council meetings ago. So in addition to the revenues, we have the unrestricted fund balance, we have revenues of $229 million. Now we deduct out any of those revenues that may be restricted for a purpose, and then that's the 672. That could be something like affordable housing or oceanfront encroachment. We also have, although it's labeled as a transfer in, most of this is really expenditures that ultimately get reclassified as expenditures in support of our Tidelands operating fund.
Excuse me, Dan, do you want to just explain to others what transfers in may be coming from?
So it's, in this case, it's really, it's really not a transfer in as much as some of the expenditures that we'll be talking about below will be transferred out and reclassified as a Tidelands operating expense. So that's an additional resource that will offset some of the general fund's operating expenditures. But we do have a significant amount of transfers out, 31 million, which we will talk about later, leaving us with, at the end, unappropriated resources, at least at the time of the printing of the budget. We had an additional 1.9 that would be available to appropriate for other purposes. So in allocating the prior year surplus, that $13 million, we stuck with the council's guidance we have a council policy that indicates we should use roughly half of that for near-term improvements and the remaining half to offset or reduce other long-term obligations. And this is an effort to achieve some intergenerational equity. So you've got something that benefits both long-term residents as well as something that also benefits residents in the near term. In terms of the revenues, we can see that property taxes at $113 million represent nearly 50% of all general fund revenues. That is a very stable revenue source, so the city is very fortunate to have such a large component that is from property taxes. And I've mentioned before, roughly 80% of that property tax is generated by residential property. So our next highest is sales tax. Sales tax is more sensitive to changes in consumer habits. And then transient occupancy tax is our next largest component that represents about 24.5 million and is, again, a little bit more subject to economic conditions. So in total, while we see strong growth in property taxes, overall, we see revenues starting to taper off and level out off a bit, but the strong growth is coming from property taxes. When we look at our expenditures, if we look at pure expenditures, salaries represent 71% of all general fund expenditures. As I mentioned previously, though, that transfers are an important part of our strategic savings plan. That's where we transfer money out to things like the facilities financing plan, the harbor and beaches plan, and so it's essentially strategic savings. And when we look at it in that fashion, salary and benefits really consume only 62% of general fund resources. When we look at expenditures by department, there are some of the variances have to do with monies that are moved from one department to the next. So, for example, I think City Council shows a reduction because we moved some of the airport expenditures from the city manager division, and we moved it over to the city manager's division and bolstered our efforts on airport growth control. So we see a decrease in city council and a fairly large increase to city manager. Mainly that has to do with the airport division. Now, while HR looks like it had a fairly substantial increase, that is a mistake on the finance department's behalf. We neglected to reduce their expenditures by the amount of employee contributions related to PERS. It was just an oversight on our part, which represents about $135,000. The remaining has to do with increases in consultants and employee training. In the finance department, as I've mentioned, we're bolstering our outside auditing efforts, some increases in parking equipment, and then when we get to the police department, so there's since it's the largest department, you're going to see some of the largest swings. Some of that is salaries. Of course, they get hit hardest with any increase in pension costs, new MOUs, and we are even starting to set aside money for uninsured claims this year.
Dan, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
Looking at, going back to slide 13, I guess it is, the overall. If we did not have, under the city manager's augmentation because of the John Wayne Airport project, if we didn't have that increase, well, overall, what would be the total, approximately, general government increase for all the departments?
So I think the increase amounted to roughly, looks like about $350,000. So it's about $475,000 increase for city manager and $117K reduction to the city council.
And the human resources correction?
Was 135.
So basically, I'm looking at the percentage increase year to year in spending, excluding John Wayne Airport expenses, just roughly.
I'd have to come back to you with.
All right, well, anyway, my point was going to be, I just want to commend staff. So I'm trying to put forth a compliment to staff that has really held the line on budget spending consistently year to year and under the city manager's first budget. I'm pleased to see that, and I know we have made council level decisions on the spending on John Wayne Airport, which is the right thing to do, and that's costing the city money. I just want the residents to know that the 10.2 increase in general government reflects actual spending, but for a special project like John Wayne Airport advocacy programs that we're embarking on and participating in, that reflects a higher spending level. I just want to be clear that.
Correct, and so even with those increases, overall, the general fund operating expenditures only increased 3.2%.
That's very good. So thank you for getting that. Thank you, Susan. All right, thank you.
And
Mr. Muldoon, would you like to speak, please?
Yes, thank you. On this item, assessment districts number 114 and 114B, I have a conflict based on my employment telecom industry, so I'll excuse myself for the entire slide.
okay. If there are no further questions on the department expenditures, we'll move to the slide that Councilmember Muldoon is referring to.
Just a slide.
Which includes, so it's general fund transfers, but it does include about $88,000 that was necessary to cover some shortfalls in assessment districts 114 and 114B. I can speak to the other transfers. Is it appropriate to ask Mr. Muldoon? Okay. So you can see a lot of the transfers are being, you can see there's a fair amount of our budget that is being allocated to infrastructure, $5 million in general fund CIP, $10 million to the facilities financial plan, $2.5 million for facilities maintenance, $5.5 million to harbor and beaches, even though the planned the planned contribution to harbor and beaches was only $3.5 million. We sent an extra $2 million in there for good measure. And the neighborhood enhancement, although it shows $5 million, as I said, we allocated about $6.5 million to neighborhood enhancements net of that 28 credit purchase. And we're further buttressing our workers' compensation program with an additional $3 million to that program.
Want to make a comment?
Yeah, it might be worth remembering also on the FFP that that's where we pay the Civic Center debt out of. So when we're looking at the amount that is being allocated over there, it's not that we're transferring 8.5 or proposed a little over $10 million for buildup of eventual reserve of building replacement. It's that we're sending it over from the general fund in order to make sure that we're making payment on this debt. In addition to the excess amount would also be going toward the FFP. So I just wanted to make sure I reminded folks that that's what that number represented.
Thank you. Very good. So notable program enhancements include, as I mentioned, the airport-related issues. We're sending some one-time expenditures for paramedic school. EMS equipment replacement, a one-time expenditure of $100K. There's additional membership increase to Metronet, the JPA, and some other smaller increases. Well, it's important to point out the homelessness services through CityNet, that we're increasing our contribution by $200K, and that we're proposing some changes in the way we deliver electrical services in the municipal operations department, utilities department, on how they service the street lights. And I previously mentioned bolstering our internal-external efforts. So those are the things that were baked into the city manager's proposed budget. Are there any questions on this slide before I move on?
You want to? No? Okay.
No? Okay. So I mentioned internal service fund charges. So these are the charges that represent, to keep things simple, that expenditures that might otherwise be lumpy or non-linear in nature, where it's not a steady amount each year, but we're going to save money, and then a large expenditure may go out in year 2 or 3. So we set money aside, and in this case, it's $30.1 million is being set aside for future expenditures through our internal service charges. So you can see I'm highlighting some of the larger variances. And in terms of full-time staffing, the city manager proposed budget reflects a net full-time increase of 1 position. And we can talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, and I'm going to suggest maybe use a different graphic next time so that they're actually full heads.
Full heads.
Just saying.
That's what happens when you're a bad city employee. It's off with your head.
Yeah.
Is there a message there?
I hear you.
Yeah, we're adding
Sometimes
the
I
body,
feel
but
that
not the
way.
head.
Yeah, this is the best
Especially here.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is the best attended meeting for staff of the year, and you made that as the slide.
All the heads are going.
Now, if I can have my pick, you know.
You cannot.
Well, I will make a serious comment on this chart. Since 2014, when many of us started on the council, one of our determining goals was to level set headcount and keep it flat till we kind of got things in order. We had some big bills to pay. We still have big bills to pay. So over these 6 years plus the projected, I'm really pleased to see that headcount number relatively flat. That's important. As we go further into the budget discussion, I'm wondering if we're holding back too much. And I know we've had this other conversation about it's less expensive to hire full-time workers versus paying contract workers, and you run the numbers on those on a case-by-case basis. So I appreciate what staff has been doing these last 5 or 6 years. That's the right thing to do. But in my own opinion, personally, as we go forward to ensure that we are providing the level of service that the residents are expecting in our city, and public safety and across the board. So we've been under this tight control now for about 10 years since the Great Recession. So I'm just mindful of that to be sure that we're not just putting numbers in and flat just to, I don't know why, but we have to reflect what the community wants too, as long as we have a balanced budget, and occasionally and every year we have surpluses. So I'm just making a point that to commend staff for their tight fiscal control, and that's served us well as a city, and will continue to as we go forward. But I'm personally going to look at things with a slight edge to, are we delivering all the levels of service that we need? I'm not complaining or citing anything specifically, just that I will look at it with a different lens. Thank you.
I'll take it a step further and recommend that need might be in the area of enforcement. If we're going to look at any area within the city to increase staffing, there certainly is a need for that.
And we'll have that, there is a budget checklist item that does deal with that, and we did talk about that at the planning session. And I'll also note the one additional position that is in this proposed budget is one that we really took a careful look at and what it costs to do from a contract basis, and found that bringing in a full-time employee was actually going to be more cost-effective for us. And so this, while it's a net increase in personnel, the total cost related to that is a decrease, given that we were able to adjust the contract dollars down.
Good.
So the staffing chart kind of followed the need to keep up with the increase in pension costs. And if we look at the planned payments towards our unfunded liability, you can see it dramatically increased from $21.2 million to today, where we're proposing a $35 million payment on our unfunded liability. And so I think by us starting early and making those increases often has put us in a very good position relative to other cities that are still trying to increase their budgets to reach those higher levels. We can see that the normal cost of our pension program is increasing because of the increased discount rates. But because we've started with the UAL ramping up our unfunded pension liability payments, you could see our UAL payments are very low at 1.4%, where other cities are looking at probably double-digit increases in their UAL payment. And we shouldn't forget the employee contributions that are also being kicked in, representing almost $10.5 million, reducing the overall annual PERS increase to only 3.6%, where other cities, as I said, are looking at double-digit increases.
Mayor Pro Tem, did you want to say something?
Actually, I'll wait until the next slide.
Okay.
So I like to look at this slide, not that I like to pick on other cities, but it's illustrative of both what this council and previous councils, due to their leadership, you can see this payment efficiency ratio at Newport Beach. We're one of the lowest in the county. And how that really manifests itself, if you look at the city below us, so we have a UAL in 2019, unfunded liability of $305 million, the city below us of $265 million. But by the time that they pay off that $265 million liability, they will have paid $50 million more than our full payment on our $300 million contribution. So hats off to City Council for being as aggressive as you are towards pension liability, and shows how much money we're saving relative to other cities that are in this 200% of principal being paid.
Well, this is the first time that I've seen that number go down. I mean, significantly from 319 to 305.
Yeah, and if you notice, of all the other cities, because they're, even though the discount rates are changing, most of their roll forward unfunded liabilities are all increasing, and there are only 3 cities in the county where the unfunded liability is projected to be decreasing because of those, both the additional discretionary payments as well as our fresh start payments as well. So we're paying significantly less interest than most cities in the county. You can see the average is close to 200%, and we're only paying about 167% of principal.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. We spend hours and hours and hours and hours of our time at the Finance Committee discussing this, because you can see this is going to be the single largest fiscal issue for our city and every other city around us and up and down the state. And we really have been doing a lot of good things with this, but we have a long way to go. I mean, when you can see at the 66% funded status, it means that we need to continue to be as aggressive as we are, and we're seeing some of the fruits of it, especially when we compare ourselves to cities that are on a daily basis. Now we're seeing news talking about what the increases in their default pension payments are doing to them. I mean, just today, Torrance was in the news talking about their inability to cover all of their budget. They're talking cuts. Santa Monica cuts. One of our neighboring cities, they're having their meeting tonight. They're talking about balancing the budget using using portions of their reserve. And the list goes on and on and on. And I think you'll start seeing increased number of sales tax measures. We've already seen a number in the last 2 election cycles. I think we'll start seeing more. And it's a scary proposition to see that, because as we talked at the beginning of this process, sales tax revenues are the most fluctuating and decreasing of all of the taxes that we've seen. So this is something that we should be proud of, the work we're doing. It's still a long way to go, but I think that it's worth noting that folks in Newport Beach, I think, have gotten used to the fact that we've got balanced budgets, we're surpluses, and we're paying down the pension liability, and believe that to be normal. And if you talk to our council colleagues in other cities, you'd realize very quickly it's not. So it's just worth noting how important this issue is.
Thank you.
Mr. Muldoon.
Thank you. I remember running 100 years ago in 2014 on this issue as one of the most paramount issues, I believe, for the city of Newport Beach. And I'd still like to be even more aggressive than it is now. But I have to tell you that staff has not been hesitant to work with us on this issue. And as we talked about head lobbying off earlier, staff is not always excited to work on something, but this is something that Finance Committee, the council, and staff has been working diligently on in uniformity. And I remember right after we were elected in 2014, the prior council heard the message loud and clear, so they did the fresh start, essentially flattering us, I think, with a chord that we had struck. And we've been doing it since, and I think we should continue to do it at the highest rate possible, because as Councilman O'Neill, or Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill had mentioned, these sales tax increases will be coming to a city near you, but not Newport Beach. Thank you very much, staff.
Thank you. So, Actuaries tend to not put a lot of faith in council promises to make additional discretionary payments. So this is a projection of our funded status moving forward, assuming a 7% annual return and no further ADPs. You can see us moving into that 73% on the safety and 80% by 2023. Our additional discretionary payments will boost that. But again, that's predicated on a 7% annual return, which in some views may be still optimistic, but time will tell.
That'd be good if we could do that.
So in the budget book, and in the previous slide, I noticed there was unrestricted resources of about 1.9 when you start considering your checklist options. Since then, Council approved 2 further budget amendments during the year for emergency storm drain repair due to the heavy rains, as well as additional weed abatement. So we're down to about 1.3 million before we start considering the items on the checklist. And then we'll move into the checklist to highlight. So there's the addition of the 2 motor officers at 316,000, and that is offset by some additional revenues, as well as a ask to continue the funding for the cold case investigators. If there are any other questions or
Well, how would you like to handle this part? Should we be commenting or wait till you're finished with all the checklist items? Is this it on the checklist?
This is the checklist, and we would encourage you to provide any feedback, nods that you might.
Yep, so maybe we just highlight briefly, it's over on within 2 pages, so it's this slide and then the next one that goes through the ones that are listed. And I think the primary one here to point out is, as Dan mentioned, that there is a proposal here to consider 2 motor officers. We talked about that a bit at the planning session, and this is in terms of addressing additional enforcement on the traffic side that we heard a bit about. So that's certainly up for discussion. The community development ones are additional hours to be added as part of the general plan update and the extensive amount of resource and work that will be taking. So that will be for a set period of time. We think a 2 to 3 year period of time, and then could phase out from there. So that's primarily on this first slide. If we move to the second one, I think the really primary one to point out, there is some one-time costs associated with if we do add 2 motor officers, that there's equipment related to that would need to be considered, but that would be one-time in nature. And then the other one that I would point out on the utilities department, there's a couple of contracts, significant contracts that will be coming up for our procurement process over this next year. And given where we're seeing with prevailing wage and other factors, we do feel like those will be sizable increases. And so rather than do a budget amendment in its entirety when they come up, I'm suggesting here to put some money aside, knowing that there's going to be some increases going on. So these are the sum of what we have right now for proposed budget revisions to be discussed. I'm happy to discuss further. Would like to get some discussion and direction, or mostly direct discussion on these. I mean, they'll be up for adoption on June 11th, as well as if there's other areas of items to be added onto this checklist. I think today would be a good day to bring those up if there's interest from the council on that.
Mr. Muldoon, did you have a comment?
On the sculpture garden funding,
Yes.
what's that coming from? Don't we have a special fund we can use for that?
Yes, so as I had put in in the proposed budget, I had it budgeted in general fund, so 115,000 in general fund, and then anticipating 20,000 of donation contributions from the Newport Beach Foundation. But given that there is Visit Newport Beach funds that have a restricted use of generally recreation and cultural programming, felt it was better to move this over to a more restricted funding source rather than the general funding source. So that's what this switch would be doing.
It's not out of the general fund.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. So this is actually a positive for the general fund if this were adopted.
Go ahead.
Okay, so is now the proper time to share our opinions, which we have tons
You know,
of. up
why
here.
don't I just have 2 brief slides, like kind of in closing. Maybe I'll just do that, and then we kind of can open up to the discussion and then out to the.
Okay.
So I just, as my first budget here, I'm really proud of all the work that the staff has done in putting this together. This is a great city, and one of the best parts of the city is the financial strength here, and I think. It's unusual when you have such great assets to be in with natural assets, strong property tax and values here, and that's coupled with such a strong sense of fiscal discipline from the city council and from the staff and from the community, and those together I think really make a really strong position here. So I don't need to go through all these points. A lot of them were covered by Dan going through here, but I really think this is a good budget that continues that stability throughout and lays out a really good positive foundation. I think the areas particularly to focus on as we continue going forward, though, is our aging infrastructure and making sure we're maintaining and funding for those in the future. And we have a great set of master plans and financial funding sources to set those up. And I think we'll need to continue to do that and be aggressive in that area. So if we move to the next slide, and this again we've talked about. So just briefly, I think we're very fortunate that our largest general fund revenue source is property tax, and that's very stable and growing. And as you saw, that we have a 6.5% almost increase showing there. But really, we do have to watch on the sales tax and TOT, which will show more volatility, and that's kind of the give that we got to watch carefully for. And I think we've talked enough on the pensions of the great work we're doing, but really needing to be mindful of the performance of the PERS fund, and we'll really be at the mercy of that in terms of having to react to that as we continue forward. And I mentioned on the aging infrastructure there of being mindful in the future for that. So with that, I think we're happy to take questions and go from there.
All right, Mr. Muldoon, if you want to complete. Oh, Mr. Herdman, please.
Yeah. So you're taking suggestions in today for the budget checklist. Okay. I've had a request from the Orange County River Park project for an allocation of $10,000 that would match what Costa Mesa and Huntington Beach have already approved. The funds would go towards the production of dealing with plastics on our beaches and in our bay, and the prevention of, and our new trash wheel, once it's installed, would be featured in this video. So this is an item I'd like to recommend be on the budget checklist.
Okay, any other council ideas? Mayor Pro Tem?
Mr. Webb identified that there's already 20,000 set aside in the CIP for that purpose.
No, I think that's different.
This was a video? Okay,
No production.
For the river park?
I think that was for their concept plan.
Yeah, that's for a concept plan. That's separate from
Excuse
this.
me,
Is
sorry.
Yeah, this would be additional, but one time though. Correct, Councilmember Herdman.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, so let's see, one of the items in here is the traffic officers. So I remember we had had this discussion during the planning session. Was this what you were going to talk about? Do you want to do it first? Because I'm happy to talk about it, but did you? Okay. So Councilmember Muldoon and I had spoken directly to this issue, and one of the issues, and I recall the slide that came up, and I'm looking at it right now, during our study, I'm sorry, what did we call that? The planning session, thank you, back in February, was about this particular issue. And so it said additional staffing from 8 to 10 would add about 10 hours of motor officer time each day of the year and increases traffic enforcement by about 25%. And then when we were talking about that issue in particular, the discussion was, what exactly did we need it for? I mean, what was out there? What were the metrics that were showing a required usage and the need for an additional 2 motor officers? And I haven't heard the justification for it. I know that there are federal standards. I know there are state standards. I know there are standards all over the place that would justify additional officers when it comes to the motors. And so I'm trying to understand, have we seen an increase in accidents? Have we seen an increased number of claims being made? I mean, when we're trying to look at when we've already looked at a slide in this budget talking about our safety pension plan being so low funded, adding 2 more officers without a very, very, very strong justification for it is a difficult proposition. So I'm trying to understand, when we're talking about the metrics on this, what have we seen? What spike have we seen that would justify the required a request for 2 more motor officers?
Madam Mayor and members of the council, Dennis Birch from the Police Department. Those metrics are a couple things. We're in the top third of cities in our state of our size for nighttime injury collisions. That's a pretty significant number. We also have been tracking in the last few years the number of community requests for specific traffic enforcements in various community neighborhoods. And last year we had 500 of those requests. In the year prior, 2017, we had, I think, 650 some odd of those requests. That goes in addition to the school safety stuff that we're doing in light of the Brock McCann accident a few years ago, where we've been trying to provide a higher and more visible presence in and around our schools to provide a little bit more safety there. Education on the same note in those areas specifically. So those are the metrics. This would give us about 300 more shifts per year of motor officers and traffic safety. We do about 12,000 vehicle code citations, but one thing we hear consistently from our community in any community meeting is the need or the desire for more enforcement as it relates to traffic and traffic safety.
I'd just note, additional traffic enforcement would not have saved Brock McCann. I think using his name on this one is a little bit over the line. Officer, I just want to say I recognize I've got young kids. I get that, but I'm just going to say that particular incident would not have been saved with additional traffic enforcement. So when we're using the justification, we're talking about statistics. I think it's important that we focus in on what we're talking about. So if we're and I recognize I get it.
Sorry, my intent was not to bring up him as justification for this. I bring that up as it really highlighted our need to get out and be more present in and around the schools as they get in and out, and it has nothing, I agree with you, and I didn't mean, and that wasn't my intent to do that, so I appreciate your comments.
Okay, so then if I'm hearing this correctly, when we're talking about adding in 2 more officers, we're talking about a public perception that we need more because we've got a lot more requests from the community for more enforcement. And then the second is that we have nighttime collision issues. And so what are we doing currently to address the nighttime collision issues, and what would we do if we had 1 or 2 more officers?
It's a fair question. Right now we're assigning one of our motors from our daytime staffing to a part-time look Friday, Saturday nights, some of our busiest nights, to do nighttime enforcement, to address some of those concerns. One of the things we would look at strongly with 2 additional officers is providing a more comprehensive nighttime operation with our traffic folks.
All right, I'll turn it over to someone else if they wanted to ask about this particular item.
All right, Mr. Avery.
Thank you. I've had several community meetings in my district about this subject, and not just about school safety, although we're in Newport Heights, everyone knows there's 3 schools there and there's lots of congestion. I will tell you that in 3 or 4 meetings over a couple of years, the number one thing residents talk about is they'd like to see more presence in the area, not just at school times, but in general. And there's just, it's not statistics, but people have repeatedly testified to people blowing stop signs, speeding, all the rest of it. And so, obviously, this is a big decision, and it needs to be based on facts and numbers, but it seems to me there's a general feeling that, at least in my district, they would like to see more police around. There's been, obviously, crime up in Kings Road that's pretty well known about in terms of the break-ins in homes. And not to be alarmist about this or anything, but I think there's a general feeling. Part of policing is perception and people feeling comfortable in their neighborhoods. And I think that presence is really important to them. So, and beyond that, I know for a fact on Coast Highway and all that, where I spend a lot of time, there's just an incredible amount of speeding along there. So I agree with Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill. There needs to be facts on this. We need to figure that out. But I'm also very concerned about the perception of our residents, how they feel, if they feel safe in our community, and if they feel that there's enough force out there to counteract the bad behavior of some of our residents and visitors, which are very much in the minority, but still there, and there's a general feeling that it's increased. And I'm not speaking from my own viewpoint. I'm just basically relating what residents have repeatedly told me out there. So I agree we should certainly wind in some hard numbers on this, but I think there's another factor, and I know council's well aware of that because I'm sure everyone up here has heard that also. Thank you.
Mr. Muldoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem O'Neill, for bringing it back to the planning session. It's pretty rare that I get people who reach out to me, and I had 2 people reach out to me on this issue saying that they agreed. It's not that people don't want more police officers, it's that traffic enforcement is so low on the totem pole. I understand there's a necessity for the sake of funds from the federal government and from the State Department of Transportation. And but if those numbers are being met, I'm much more concerned. With school safety, we recently agreed to split up an officer with Newport Mesa Unified School District, and with enforcement from residential burglaries. That's in no world would I even be considering buying a motorcycle and 2 more police officers on bikes for daytime enforcement for traffic, mostly traffic issues and citations, versus a nighttime patrol officer or a daytime patrol officer in a vehicle. Unless I was given some numbers to show otherwise that were perhaps below some federal standard or some state mandate. For those reasons, especially looking at the unfunded pension liability, I would strongly be against these 2 officers. And I think the tendency to say, oh, look, we're doing better, let's hire more, is sort of the tendency of someone who has half their credit card bills paid off and they want to go start spending money right away. And I just think that's not, unless I saw data otherwise, that's not the right attitude to protect the city long term. That being said, I think we have one of the best police departments in the state, and I will always be open to another officer on the beat in a particular area, especially for the more, what I would argue, the more important crimes being committed, but that is not, traffic would not fall under that, even if you would argue that it's a fluid system that frees up a patrol officer. I still don't think traffic is the right place to put those resources. So for that reason, I do not support the 2.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem.
One other thing, Dennis, when we're looking at the staffing levels at the police department, we have increased, we've actually filled vacancies at the department in the last year or 2, if I understand correctly.
Yes, we're, I think, just about or right at our authorized strength now. Most of that right now, I think it's about 13 kids in the recruits in the academy are just having graduated in the academy and the field training program. So probably sometime by the end of summer, we should be up to full staffing across the board in patrol, where we have held those vacancies for a few years. Yes, sir.
Yeah, see, I think that's important as well when we're talking about this, because once we get to full staffing, what that means for us is that we will have more folks out in the public, and that is sometimes as important as increasing positions. I mean, even if we authorize this right now and in this next budget cycle, we would still need to go through the recruitment process, which, as I recall, takes quite a while because we do a great job and a robust job of recruiting people into the department, but we also do background checks and make sure we're getting some of the best people. And echoing Councilmember Muldoon's point, we really do have one of the best police departments in the state. And so I'm not there. I can't, I don't think I can support this one either right now, but I am pleased that we're finally getting up to full staff, and I'm no doubt we'll see folks out on the, more folks out on the streets as we are able to make that work. Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to address the public safety aspect. As Councilmember Avery was pointing out in his town halls, as everybody may know, I've had 22 town halls in the last 4 years, and every single town hall deals with residents concerned about public safety, whether it's on the boardwalk, whether it's at the Newport Pier area, and between 2 and 3 a.m., whether it's now newer issues related to short-term rentals and the all hours of the day of those issues where police enforcement as well as code enforcement is required. And then also the good news is that we have a dedicated police officer, Officer Yim, for homeless. Well, that position has been taken off the street for all intents and purposes for other forms of public safety. So I appreciate Councilmember Muldoon's comment, whether it's maybe not, I'm not going to comment on the justification or lack thereof about traffic, because I hear comments, as Mr. Avery does, people about traffic enforcement. But public safety, I mean, we all know what we read, that crime levels all over the state because of recent legislation and propositions and people are being released from jails or not even serving time in jail, and it's affecting our community. And I am very cognizant of the fact that the Balboa Peninsula, which happens to be my district, of course, receives the lion's share of the 11 million visitors that visit our city of 85,000. So we are tremendously proud of our police department, of an 85,000 population, but yet we truly have about 200,000 people visiting our city on a daily basis during the high season. And this imposes significant demands and pressures of those parts of our city that are receiving these visitors, and they may not be going to all parts of the city, but they certainly are concentrating on the peninsula where the beach is, and Corona del Mar and Balboa Island. And I'm particularly cognizant of the demands and the incident reporting that the facts and the data will show that we have significant demands placed on our police force. What I would like to say or suggest, because I am very cognizant that we are, I've used this metaphor, if you will, that we are pouring 5 pounds of public safety incident requests and calls for service into a 2-pound bag. And our police force has been exceptionally responsive, but we still have significant issues on the peninsula that are being met, but and I'm not being critical, but there is still demand. And we're continually adding to that demand because we have great restaurant operators that are adding economic value to our city, but that also creates a lot of disturbances. And we have, at this very moment, we have about 7 applications for additional alcohol serving establishments on the peninsula. So my overall question, and we'll deal with this at other venues, but we are putting so much demand on our police and our residents' tolerance and expectations for public safety when we don't stop and look at what are we doing to best serve public safety in our community. What I would like to suggest, and as the city manager mentioned, that we are going to be putting items here for possible consideration, and then we will decide on this at the June 11th meeting, if I'm correct, that I ask staff to really come back with some data that we could look at related to the traffic issues to show where we're maybe not meeting or just barely meeting the federal and state standards on traffic safety, and understand where the demand is on the residential areas and the intersections that we're maybe not responding to quickly enough. I'd also like so I could look my residents in the face and say that when they say they never see a police officer, and I'm not saying this critically, it's hard to get to the whole 7 miles with 3 police officers, and we've got boardwalk issues constantly, and for 4 years I've heard this from the residents that they need more police enforcement on for homeless, for short-term rentals, for the restaurant areas at the Newport Pier, and just overall protection. So at the June 11th meeting, I'd like staff to come back with the data that shows what is going on in our city. I do not want to be oblivious to the real issues that are going on, so I could tell our residents that we are at the right complement, we're doing all the right things, or are we short? Now, I said this 4 years ago when we did add 4 police officers. Of the 8 that were cut back during the recession in 2008. So we've never, you could correct my information if I'm stating this incorrectly, but we've never returned to that former level. And we're still down. We added 4 in 2015, and we're still down, but as far as feet on the ground, we've lost to the homeless management process, we've lost 1 officer. So I'd just like to look at where we are and how we're meeting the needs of the city, and so we could have a robust debate with facts and figures on June 11th and really understand what we need to do. I don't know if it's 3, I don't know if it's 2, I don't know if it's motorcycle or if it's boots on the ground. I want to make an informed decision because, as Mr. Muldoon said, this is very significant, it's very costly. Cities around the state are really not hiring expensive public safety employees because of this very issue. But I don't want to compromise safety in our community, and I want to make the decision in the right way with the right data. So that's my request. Please, thank you. Ms. Brenner.
Thank you, Mayor Dixon. I have a question about how resources are delegated. So if a police officer is a traffic officer and there is crime in the area, does that officer not address that, or is he just specifically on traffic?
No, ma'am, and that's a good question. No, our motor officers are primarily assigned to traffic enforcement, but they also do special events. They also do the quality of life stuff. They're out on the boardwalk enforcing some of that stuff. They do help with other calls for service. In fact, at times of heavy and peak traffic, they're also some of our first officers to respond to calls for service because their ability to move through traffic a little bit more easily than a regular patrol car and a beat unit. So they do a lot of different stuff. They do school safety. They are out, in the schools providing and adding to what our SROs do when they're out there at those times. They're a police officer like everybody else. They just happen to be on a motorcycle, and they just happen to have their primary assignment be traffic enforcement, but that's not all that they do.
Okay, that was my first question. And anecdotally, I'd just like to say that in the 57 years that I've been driving in Newport Beach, there have always been certain places that you knew to be really careful because, like on the peninsula, I remember in years past, you would never speed on the peninsula because you knew that there were traffic officers there that were going to catch you. On Marguerite, up the hill at the stop sign there, you knew you always came to a 4-way stop there. I've had people complaining to me just in the last week about the Village, that people are just blowing through stop signs there. And I don't feel like we have that same sort of feeling these days, like you really have to be careful. I've recently spent quite a bit of time in Texas, and we would be driving down the street, and all of a sudden I'm like, what's wrong? What's happening? And it's like, we're at a school zone. In a school zone, they slow down. They significantly slow down. I don't think we have that feeling, not just in Newport Beach, but in probably California in general. But the presence of patrol officers certainly is a deterrent in those areas. And I see this as a cost of doing business. In a business model, if you've got the increase that we have in revenue with property taxes, this is just one of the costs that you incur in order to keep those property taxes high. People want to feel like they are getting top quality service for the amount of property taxes they pay. So I am definitely in support of this measure.
Mr. Muldoon.
So my goal for Newport Beach is not that we're Victorville, some sort of speed trap place where people always follow every stop sign, although I think it's important. My goal is that people in Newport Beach feel safe in their homes. If you were to say, look, we have a slight increase in crime, we follow this closely, we need someone at nighttime patrol car, I'd probably vote for it. At the end of the day, I understand it can be offensive. Quite frankly, people run stop signs right in front of a school by my house. I suspect that some of them have warrants out and they're not upright citizens, and they're quite frankly been released based on the fact all these crimes have been reduced. But those are just assumptions I would make based on my time as a DA. So I'm sure some upstanding citizens also are running stop signs, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, I'd rather put a public safety emphasis on residential break-ins and serious crimes, having an enforcement. And I know also, sure, you definitely can have a trial or a crime that was the first person on scene was a motorcycle officer. It happens. But it's often a very morning to day shift opportunity for an officer, and it's not the same sort of frequency of crime fighting prevention as an officer in a vehicle. And if you're going to, sometimes they will strategically put a motorcycle officer in a certain area where they know there's a lot of criminal activity and pull them over for violations that are not that severe, in hopes of seeing if this person has a warrant. But that's not really, unless you're going to say otherwise, that's not really the crime fighting mechanism we use in Newport Beach. It's more responsive based on complaints from neighbors or calls about break-ins.
I'll say this about that presence, and there is a crime fighting model called DDAX, data-driven approach to traffic crime, traffic safety, and it's the high visibility of traffic stops to have a deterrent, or there's the theory that it has a deterrent effect on criminals in the area. We don't really have the numbers to do that, but we do put our motor officers in our high crime areas to help us deter crime. And quite frankly, if we can stop crime before it ever happens, without making an arrest or find somebody with a warrant, that's our mission and our goal.
So I would love to see that information in the next meeting. What I don't want is I don't want to vote for this and see an extra car on Jamboree or an extra motorcycle on Jamboree. That's not, the residents I speak to, they want to feel safe in their own home, and that's, I think, a better use of resources than getting someone who's on their way to Irvine, who's an upstanding citizen who works a 9-to-5 job there, and they live in Newport Beach. But that's my personal philosophy, and if I don't have all the votes, my colleagues disagree with me, that's fine. But I would love to know I care about crime reduction more so than traffic enforcement. Unless you can show a correlation, I'm very open to that. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
I guess in the grand scheme of things, I mean, we're talking about a nearly $400 million budget, and we've now spent 20 minutes talking about two employee positions. I would strongly recommend, given the number of questions and analysis that we're asking for up here, that this not be part of the checklist, that we have an unallocated general fund surplus going into the budget year, and then bring this back as a separate general business item in July or August, when we have more data and analysis that we can do on a standalone basis, because this is going to require a pretty hefty amount of analysis when it comes to what is going to be the impact of the additional 13 recruits coming in terms of the presence that we see out there. What exactly will we be seeing in terms of if we want to bring down the nighttime levels versus the school? Obviously, those are going to be different shifts, and we're going to have different allocation resources, and there's no way we're going to be able to have just two bodies that will be able to cover both, reduce the nighttime accident rates as well as mornings with our mornings or afternoons in the schools. And we would have to do a pretty robust analysis of whether that's going to change shifts, whether that's going to modify the bodies on the streets, and where exactly would these be allocated in order to get this. So I guess what I'm saying is there's no way that we should be holding up a $400 million budget at our next meeting causing council members to have to decide whether to support it or not support it based on 2 employment positions, when this is something that needs a lot more analysis, and frankly will not be, if we spend that much time analyzing 2 positions, we won't be able to get the budget passed right away, as quickly as I would anticipate. So I would strongly recommend that, given the amount of analysis we've already done just up here and the questions we've been asking, this come back in July after we've already passed the budget, and we at least maintain. And one other thing, we got to also keep in mind, there is not there's not an allocated funding source right now for addressing homelessness. And so as we're going through and addressing that on the homelessness task force, we need to have this unallocated general fund to be able to have a discussion at the dais level of what our priorities will be when it comes to how to address homelessness. And that task force is going to be really important for making those decisions for us. So if we are starting to reduce down the general fund, the unallocated general fund balance, we are limiting our abilities to respond to that, as well as just about anything else in the city. So I would just caution. I would suggest caution when it comes to going above and beyond at the moment.
Mr. Duffield.
Thank you, Mayor. The Mayor Pro Tem took the words out of my mouth, so I would just support what he just said. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments up here? Why don't we ask members of the Finance Committee who are sitting in the front, I was going to say the front pew, the front row. Would anyone like to come up and speak on the proposed budget? Please come forward.
All right. This one. Like my first time doing this. It's on?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor Dixon, members of council. My name is Joe Stapleton. It's a pleasure serving as a Finance Committee member. I've been through this process a number of times with our previous city manager, Dave Kiff. This is my first time going with our new city manager, Grace. I'm pleased that we continue a strong focus on services, capital infrastructure, maintenance, and improvement, and long-term liability paydown carries forward. I am encouraged that the hard work conducted on our Finance Committee has paid off. While neighboring cities are discussing dipping into the reserves to balance their budget, we have fully funded our reserve and are instead discussing surpluses and paying down our pension liabilities. This is a budget that addresses our city's major issues, and it's a pleasure to serve on the city's Finance Committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Larry Tucker, member of the Finance Committee. Last 2 years I've talked about unfunded pension liabilities. That's where the real money is and the real issues are with the city. June 30th, 2007, we had unfunded pension liabilities of $2 million. June 30th, 2017, that number is $319.7 million. What happened? How did we end up going $300 million into pension debt? Well, there's 3 main sources of where these pension liabilities come from. Shortfall of investment returns, changes of actuarial assumptions, and changes of assumed investment returns. The changed actuarial assumptions account for about $37 million of that amount of money. Changes to the discount rate over the past 3 years were $65 million. Apparently there were changes that occurred approximately 10 years ago. Most of the money, however, $180 million or so, is for investment returns that aren't there. CalPERS invests our money for us. They carry a big portion of their portfolio in fixed income. That's generating 2.5–3%. So that means they have to make that much more with the balance. When you just look at the numbers, it's not hard to envision that we're going to have issues in the future. Now, the Finance Committee and the City Council now have addressed, well, what are we doing with this $320 million? We have a plan now that pays it off over 15 years. That doesn't cover us for what may happen in the future. And it doesn't, when you have the amount of money that we have, $620 million in a fund, we're lacking $320 more million that we're supposed to have in the fund. But if we don't earn a return on the $600 million that's in the fund, or if it's a bad year or losses occur, and you end up with not making the 7%, but maybe losing 3%, that's another $60 million of unfunded pension liabilities that you have to start amortizing at the discount rate, 7%, over 20 years. So you can see that that it's fairly possible that this just isn't going to work, and at some point in time you're going to run out of money for how you deal with that type of problem. Even Newport Beach, fewer employees, less services seem inevitable. So it really is a problem that needs to be addressed at a statewide level. I think Newport's doing everything possible and then some, and we're just fortunate that we have the revenue sources that we do. But it's the type of thing where no matter how hard you try and how responsible you are, it just may not be something that Newport Beach can handle on its own. So sorry to bring that good news to an otherwise upbeat pension discussion, but it's something I just kind of mention every year because ultimately it's going to have to be addressed. Thank you.
That's right. It's just the cold reality. Mr. Reed, did you want to speak? No? Mr. Calvi, did you want to speak? All right. Why don't we open it up to the public? Other members of the public, if you'd like to come forward.
Mayor Dixon and members of the council, my name is Jim Mosier. I have two basic comments. The first one is the comment I make every year, which is related to the charter provision that assures the public that the council can delegate to the city manager the authority to write contracts for things that the council has approved in the budget, provided they're under a certain dollar amount, yet the public doesn't really know what has been approved in the budget, because in the budget book, the 466-page PDF version of the budget, we see only line items. For instance, a line item professional services, $200,000. We don't know what professional services were anticipated. And the new thing I wanted to bring to that this afternoon is earlier today I was at the study session of my local sanitary district. Their budget is like the budget of one of our small departments. This is the first part of their budget that looks very much like our budget book. In it, you will find under operations and maintenance for their solid waste fund, as an example, it has a line item for professional services, $63,000. But you go a little further, and there's some attachments that break down what the line item is for, what the sanitary district staff was requesting $63,000 for, and you see that they're asking for approval to spend $30,000 on public relations, $620 on cloud backup, $600 on website maintenance, $6,000 on a waste hauler internal audit, and so on. This information, obviously, in our case, because we have a much bigger budget, couldn't be printed out, but it could be in that online budget. So that, because I assume this has to exist somewhere in Newport Beach. The line items in our budget just don't come out of thin air. Somebody has thought what the expenses are going to be in each department for each need during the year, and they must have a detailed breakdown like this. And one would think we could make that public somehow. I think our open budget portal might be a way to do that. And then the second comment I want to make is that budgets are about details like the motor officers. And I'll make the same comment on this same detail that I looked at and spoke about it to the Finance Committee. It's the first detail you come to in our budget book in the expenditures by division. The first category is the City Council, and I don't know if all 7 City Council members need to recuse themselves when I talk about this, but this page is showing your base wages, and the number that the public is seeing is $16,888, and that happens to be a 6.1% increase from what it was in the previous budget, but our city charter limits the increase to the cost of living or 5%, whichever is less. So I'm curious, I've not seen any revision in the checklist that there's something wrong with this. And instantly you don't see this in the open budget, so that would be a question whether that's an error or if it's going to be corrected later in the budget process, or we found some way to work around the charter and grant the council a bigger increase that's normally entitled to. And then a separate question, but I've run out of time. As you'll see, the council is unique in that it gets more benefits. So in addition to the charter allowed compensation, there's a whole bunch of benefits. And the previous...
Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Moser. Thank you. Dan, would you like to, or Susan, would you like to just clarify that
Sure.
comment about the city council?
When
Yeah.
we prepared the fiscal year 19 budget, we neglected to include an estimate for the CPI increase that the charter provides for you. The actual amount was 4.1%, so the fiscal year 19 revised budget includes that amount. And then we estimated in fiscal year 20 a 2% CPI adjustment. So
that's...
yeah, it's two
Okay.
increases, and it conforms to the requirements.
Okay. And in the open gov, the line item question that he had, is that all provided there?
It is not.
It is not.
We have the detail for some of the accounts, but we've not required of all accounts.
Okay.
So that could be a goal for fiscal year 21.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Muldoon.
Thank you. Larry, I appreciate the way you phrased it. It reminds me of a friend of mine who has an incompetent uncle that runs his family trust. And he can't get rid of that uncle because the uncle just happens to be the brother of his father who established the trust. And all he can do is live within a more unlimited means today because his inheritance will be less than it should be because his uncle is incompetent. And that incompetent uncle is CalPERS, essentially, in your story. And that is why we up here are debating whether we need 2 or more traffic officers, because we do not control the returns and the investments that are made. It's totally controlled by the state of California and legislation and by groups that we do not have influence over. So it's not that we would not like to have more traffic officers, although actually I'm a little libertarian and they're not my favorite thing to deal with if you are going 5 miles over the limit. But it is something that we have to really consider, because the other thing I like that you mentioned, Larry, which is true, is that we are not in the clear yet. There's many things that could occur that would put Newport Beach in a really bad position. And then the least of our concerns would be how many traffic officers we have. And so I'm actually not even fully appreciative of staff's ask on this, to be honest, and how it was asked for, to be brutally honest. But I understand the debate has to happen.
Ms. Brenner.
I had a question about Jim's remarks. As far as the detail goes, is there more that we could do in that area for transparency's sake?
Sure. So while departments aren't requested to say, okay, if they've got $100,000 or $75,000 professional services, they're not required to put into the system that $25,000 is for janitorial services, that $25,000 is for whatever service. That information may request. It's not entered into the budget system. We do have an open expenditure module where we could identify each individual check that was cut. And while it's not the same thing, you can see line by line in that professional services budget what it was expended on.
I'm not asking for a lot more staff time, but Grace, what's your take on that? Is there a way that we can be more transparent there?
Yeah, I think we can take a look at that. I think there's, to a certain level, where there's significant dollars being budgeted into a line item like a professional services that has several different types of services. I think we could take a look at providing a little more detail into that level, and we can certainly take a look at that for this upcoming year.
And for transparency, one of the things that people ask me all the time when we're talking about city council is, how much do you make for doing that job? So just for the record, could you clarify that as far as when you're talking about city council expenditures, the huge amounts of money that we're making?
The base stipend is $16,888 per year for fiscal year 20.
Thank you.
All right. I didn't mean to cut off any other public comment if there was any other public comment. All right, so this concludes our discussion on the budget. Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I'd just like to say there's a lot of work that goes into this. So first, thank you, Grace, for presenting your first budget. We're looking forward to getting to vote up or down on it in the next couple meetings. Dan, thank you. This really is it's a big lift. So and Susan, obviously, thank you very much. All our department heads, thank you for working through the process on the first budget with our new city manager, and then for our finance committee members, particularly our citizen members, thank you. You give up a lot of time from your professional lives to give back into the community. So I just wanted to say a very special thank you. And then in the fiscal year, we've also had a few folks who have served on the finance committee that have been part of this budget making process. We had Councilmember Muldoon, we had former Councilmember Piotr, and then we had citizen member Patty Gorsica. So I just wanted to say thank you as well. And then our newest member is Joy Brenner. So Joy gets to spend her first budget on the finance committee, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a little bit of a fire hose, I recognize that, but
Enjoy is not exactly the right term.
fair enough. But I just want to say thank you. This is every year. This is a big lift, but we're getting there. So thank you.
Well, and I just want to say also thank you to the committee, the public members, especially, and your diligence and care for our city, and your attention to detail and serving on subcommittees, looking into special deep dives into current critical areas. So the message to the public is that your council and your public representatives on our finance committee are really taking strong care to make sure that we're all doing the right thing and protecting and taking our fiduciary responsibilities seriously. So again, thank you, and thank you to members of the public who are here to participate in that today. So now I want to open it up to public comments on agenda and non-agenda items. If there are any, please come forward. In this portion of the meeting, is someone coming forward? No. All right. We are adjourned.